Hi and welcome back. In this video, I wanted to guide you through some of the most popular Python libraries that can be used for a variety of things. So we're going to talk about some libraries you can use to interact with databases, some that you've already seen and some that you haven't, to look at web development, a couple to do communications, like sending emails or SMS texts, a couple for GUI design for graphical user interfaces, like desktop apps, a bunch of them that can be used for data science and that are very popular, and then some for computer vision, and we're going to look at a couple of development tools as well you can use to make your life a bit easier when you're working with Python. For databases, you've already looked at SQLite 3, which comes with Python, and you can use SQLite 3 to interact with SQLite databases. There's another library that is actually fairly similar to SQLite 3 in some cases, although it's more advanced, and that's called PsychoPG2. PsychoPG2 can be used to interact with Postgres databases as opposed to SQLite databases. Postgres databases are also relational databases like SQLite databases are, but they are much more advanced. They let you do more things, and generally they perform better, but they're also a bit more complicated. Similarly to PsychoPG2, you've also got IOPG, which is the asynchronous version of PsychoPG2. It lets you do things like async connections to a database and sort of run other code while you wait for data to come back from the database and things like that. So if you're looking into high-performance PostgreSQL database connections from within Python and your application is asynchronous, I recommend you use IOPG. And then you've also got SQL Alchemy. SQL Alchemy is a sort of a different beast altogether. It can be used to connect to SQLite or Postgres or MySQL or Oracle or indeed any other type of database. And it sort of wraps the entire database connection in a different format. So what SQL Alchemy allows you to do, and we're going to look at this later on in the course, in this section, what SQL Alchemy allows you to do is define classes, and each class has a table and a bunch of columns, and then whenever you create an object, that sort of creates its corresponding row in the database. So it lets you work with Python only and not really worry about the database. It just gets taken care of for you. This is known as an object relational mapping, and SQL Alchemy is the most popular one in Python. For web development libraries, you've already seen Flask. I really like Flask. It's a very simple framework that nonetheless is very extensible and quite powerful. But a lot of people have heard of Django, which is sort of the big brother of web development in Python. And Django is a really powerful web framework, but it's also quite complicated. If you want to start learning learning Django, there's a lot of stuff you have to learn about how Django does things and what structure it wants you to follow in your code and how it wants you to handle X and Y and so forth. So the learning curve is much steeper. This is why I prefer Flask, especially when you're starting out. So Django can be really useful for making specific types of web applications because Django gives you a lot of things out of the box. You can just tell Django to create an app for you, and it will give you an app with a bunch of things in it, like user authentication, an administration panel, and so forth. But then, of course, that code is not code you've written, so it can limit you in what you can do to change it. You sort of have to follow its structure. As well as Flask and Django, you've got a bunch of asynchronous frameworks for web development. These are very powerful, but they are also more complicated than Flask, particularly IOHTTP that we've already seen, on Tornado. They are pretty challenging to really grasp, but they are quite powerful. They give you a lot of stuff you can do. For example, IOHTTP, as we know, gives you a client as well that you can use to make asynchronous requests, as well as do web development with it. Sanic and Quart are two new frameworks that actually don't have a lot of popularity yet, but they have been developed to be simple frameworks for web development that are asynchronous. They very much are similar to Flask in that regard, but they are asynchronous. Qt particularly actually was recently suggested to me by one of the students, and it is an exact mimic or copy of Flask, but made asynchronous, and as such it works with a lot of the Flask extensions. Flask is a very popular framework because of the extensions that sort of enhance Flask's power. Sanic doesn't have those extensions, and as such is a bit more limited in that regard. So if you want to do asynchronous web development, maybe look into Qt if you are already familiar with Flask. There's also a very popular web development framework in Python called Bottle that is the precursor to Flask and is another simple framework. I can't say much about it though because I've never actually used it, but I know that it exists and a lot of people do know about it. For communications, and this is something we're going to look at throughout the rest of this section, you've got SMTP_lib that comes built in with Python. This allows you to connect to an SMTP server. These are normally email servers like Gmail and so forth, and they let you authenticate on those servers with a username and password, and then send emails from that server using your account. So you could use SMTP_lib to log into your Gmail account and send an email through your account. So it can be really powerful, but also slightly limiting in some cases because you have to send the email using your own Gmail account. As such, we have Mailgun. Mailgun is another breed of email sending libraries. You've got a bunch of others like SendGrid that do the same job. And these essentially give you an email service that you can send emails from without requiring that you use your own personal account. So they give you an email address and you can send emails from there. It also has a nice API that you can interact with in order to send those emails, and we're going to look at this shortly. You've also got a very popular and very powerful library and indeed a company called Twilio. And Twilio does tools for communication, and they have a lot of ways of talking to their products using Python, and they can do things like send text messages, SMS. They also do things like call center products and a bunch of other stuff like real-time chats and things like that, and you can interact with all of those using Python. So if you are thinking of making some sort of chat application or you want to send text messages, look into Twilio. They are really quite good, and the pricing is fairly reasonable. It's not terribly expensive. If you have a small company and you're sending a small amount of text messages or chat sessions and things like that, it's actually pretty cheap. If you are a large company that's sending a lot of text messages or chat sessions, the price actually goes down as you increase your volume, so it ends up still being fairly reasonable. And also, I've spoken with them in a corporate setting, and they're willing to play around with the price as well. So definitely something worth considering if that's something you want to build. For GUI design, which stands for Graphical User Interface, this is something that a lot of people actually don't know Python can do. For a lot of people, Python is a sort of data science and web development language, and that's it. But actually, you've got some graphical user interface libraries that you can use to make desktop applications. And the most popular one, or I'd say maybe the best one, is called Kivy. And Kivy can be used for designing graphical user interfaces, but also for making games. Now, I haven't looked too in depth into Kivy. I've not really used it in a professional setting, but I have read through their documentation and some of their guides, and it actually looks fairly straightforward. Not too easy, but it looks doable to make games and graphical user interfaces using Kivy. Whereas, if you look into Ginter, I don't even know how to say this word, it's not so simple. This is the predecessor, it's a much older library used for making graphical user interfaces, but it's not as straightforward. So if you want to build graphical user interfaces, I definitely recommend you look into Kivy. For data science, you've got a bunch of libraries that can be used for scientific computing and sort of advanced mathematics and things like that. You've got NumPy and SciPy, which are used for just that. These are things that allow you to work with matrices and vectors and things like that. And again, I'm not much of a scientist, so I don't know much about these things, but they are the staple in the data science community. So if you've done any data science, you probably have seen these already, and if not, you definitely want to look into them. You've also got pandas and matplotlib. These are, again, used in data science very extensively. Matplotlib particularly, also outside of data science, used for creating graphs. So if you want to make like bar charts or line charts and things like that with Python, matplotlib is a good way of doing that. Also, a popular thing in data science are Jupyter notebooks. This is not really a library in Python as much as a tool that you can use to create a notebook, essentially just written notes, and you can embed within that notebook Python code. And not only that, but you can run bits of that Python code within the notebook. So if you're taking notes for a course like this one, it can be useful to create your own Jupyter notebook, take notes, and write the code that we teach you in these lectures into the notebook. And then whenever you go back to it, you can run the different code excerpts for the lecture without having to search through your files and many folders and things like that. So a pretty useful tool, but not something I've used very extensively. And of course, there are many other tools that use Python in data science, such as TensorFlow, which is not really a library per se, but still uses Python. For computer vision, it's not really something I'd recommend using Python for necessarily. I'm sure there are better ways of doing computer vision than with a language that only runs on one thread. But nonetheless, you've got OpenCV and SimpleCV. OpenCV is a large behemoth of computer vision. SimpleCV is a wrapper around it that makes it a bit simpler. So if you want to do computer vision in a sort of small scale, for example, make your application able to recognize faces and things like that, use SimpleCV. For development tools that we are going to look at in this section as well, you've got PyLint, which is a linter. Linters, essentially, you can run them and give them one of your Python files, and it will tell you if you messed up. That's essentially it. If you've got some unused variables, or maybe you forgot to import something, or you forgot to add a comment somewhere, PyLint is one of the family of linters in Python. This is the most popular one, the one I'd recommend using, and it's really helpful. It tells you when you've messed up or when you've done something that you shouldn't do, and it tells you how to fix it most of the time. So a great thing to include in your workflow. We're going to look at how to use PyLint soon. You've also got Flake 8, Yap, and Black. These are formatters. So what they do is you can run them on a Python file, and it will reformat it, add spaces and new lines where required to make your file more readable. Now, I always recommend you make your own files readable, but it can be useful to run through a formatter after you've made your file so that it always has the same style. You know, if you're working with someone else and you like putting spaces around an equal sign, and they like putting the equal sign stuck to the variable, I don't like that, but hey, some people do, then you can run both pieces of code through a formatter and they'll end up looking similar. So the style will be consistent and you won't hate each other for using different styles. We're going to look at this in the section, but if you want to read a bit more, you can go over to our blog, and we've got a link there on handy Python development tools. This is going to be linked in the resources section of this lecture as well, so feel free to give it a click and have a wee read at the blog post. Finally, something we didn't mention at the start, but there are a lot of IDEs, or integrated development environments, you can use with Python. The most popular one, the one we've been using, is PyCharm. PyCharm is made by JetBrains, and it's probably the most powerful IDE you can use in Python. It has a lot of nice features like run configurations, which allow you to run many different things from within PyCharm. It's got things like database connection handlers. It's got a built-in debugger that you can use to step through your code, and that's extremely powerful and really handy. And of course, it sort of does everything you need for Python. However, it can be a bit large. It can be a bit cumbersome. It can be quite slow to start up and to do things like searching and things like that. Also, if you open very large files with PyCharm, it can sometimes struggle. So a very popular thing to do is to have PyCharm for your sort of normal development flow, and when you require those more advanced pieces of functionality, but then also have what I like to call a glorified text editor when you want to make quick changes or you have a small project that you don't really need the power of PyCharm for. And in those cases, I like using Visual Studio Code, which is also an integrated development environment, an IDE, but it's much more sort of toned down. It doesn't do as much for you, and it can be a little bit trickier to set up nicely, but then it's fast, it's snappy. You can do basically anything you want with it, and it looks really nice as well. So I like Visual Studio Code. Some people like to use Atom or Sublime Text. These are three sort of what I call glorified text editors, and you can try them and give them a go as well. One of the great things about these three text editors is that you can change them very easily to suit what you like. So you can sort of change the themes, the colors, the way tabs show up, the icons, and everything about them, normally using cascading style sheets to do that, CSS. But of course, if you want to learn more about IDEs in Python and what sort of things you can do, we've got also a blog post, part of our 100 Days of Python series, that you can look at and goes in depth into why I think using PyCharm is the best thing to do, and sort of a few other options as well in case you want to have a look. So that's it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed this brief walk through some of the most important Python libraries out there. Let's go into the next one, so I'll see you there.